All right, hello and welcome to First Bank's Center for Family-Owned Businesses webinar series. I'm Mike Vandervelde and I'll be your facilitator. In today's session, we'll learn how strategic planning can be a foundation for a family business, for family business succession, sorry, to clarify. Just a quick reminder, the lines are muted, but at any time, please send us your thoughts and questions through the webinar tool. And at this time, I'm going to pass it over to the host of our program, Mr. Joe Ambrose.
Thanks, Mike. Good day to everyone and welcome. I'm Joe Ambrose, Executive Director of the First Bank Center for Family-Owned Businesses. Through the center, First Bank takes a holistic view of family-owned enterprises and delivers services to them beyond traditional banking products. These services are centered on insight and advice that address the family component of family-owned businesses. Today, we have Jim Del Carmen, a partner with Collaborative Strategies, Inc. I have known Jim for over 15 years and have experienced his expertise in moderating strategic planning sessions for organizations around St. Louis. Jim is a master at it. Jim's presentation will address the benefits of strategic succession planning in family businesses, as you see on the screen. And now, without further ado, my friend Jim Del Carmen.
Thank you, Joe. Good morning, everybody. It's so good to be with you. What we'd like to do is for the first 20-25 minutes, I'll give you some broad strokes in regards to strategic planning, its importance to family succession, and then as well throughout some best practices related to how to really make an actionable strategic plan. Mike, when you can, please go to the next slide. Folks, in taking a look at the two separate, very interrelated topics of family succession, ownership and management transfer from one generation to another, and strategic planning. The reason why it comes to be that it is a challenge is that oftentimes current ownership advances throughout their life cycle and are at a different stage, obviously, from when it is that they transfer ownership to the next generation or some sort of internal buying group. That being said, the key here is that both sides have to be at the table in regards to where they want to take the business. And without that, it makes ultimate succession that much more difficult. Next slide, please. So as you take a look at the three boxes in the middle, oftentimes groups start right away with, what do I do with the management transfer from one generation to the next? And then they ask, what do I do from an ownership transfer standpoint? How do I transfer ownership and control from one generation to the next? I'm of the mind that even though the three aren't mutually exclusive, it can be very, very helpful, if not required, to do strategic planning for the company first, doing what's best for the business, and then collectively, as a shared vision across multiple generations, asking where do we want to take the business in 3 to 5 years, what are our priorities to get there, and ultimately what's our action plan to make it happen. Then therefore that lays down a proper foundation so that you can start taking a look at how to transfer management responsibilities and then ultimately ownership. So in many ways, I take a look at strategic planning as a bridge between generations that again lays the foundation for effective succession. Next slide, please. So the importance of strategic planning, it strikes me, is that too often, including myself in our firm, we spend too much time in the day-to-day management side of things. For obvious reasons, right? It's for the squeakiest wheel, the hottest fire. Ultimately, it's reacting. However, we don't spend enough time on the right side, taking a look at a longer-term vision, being proactive, really understanding what our competitive advantage is. And here's the most important difference to me in strategic thinking. It really does not ask, are we doing things right? That's management. Strategic thinking says, based on the changing world around us, are we doing the right things? Are we still relevant? Are we positioning ourselves to compete in the best possible way? Next slide, please. Needless to say, all of us, regardless of the type of business we're in, if you start at the bottom of the diagram at the bottom, we're trying to reach a customer in a market. The challenge, however, regardless of how good things are, is that so many things around us are shifting and changing constantly. In fact, I make a case that things are changing faster than ever. So for me, when we talk winning strategy, we need to be relevant to a changing environment. We also need to understand how we're differentiating, because without competitive advantage, we're forced to compete on one thing, and that's price. And ultimately, a winning strategy requires that we make choices. It doesn't stop with all the good ideas of things we could do. It really asks the question, what should we do and what can we do? More about that in a moment. So big picture, strategy is not continually asking an organization to pivot. It's just saying, based on our surroundings, based on the playing field, how do we best compete and what do we need to do differently? Next slide, please. A lot of good textbook definitions out there in regards to strategy and strategic plans. To me, strategy, a practicable definition, is the collection of ideas of how we intend to win. And in order to figure out what those collection of ideas are, we need to start first at the bottom left. Where are we today? What's our current baseline? And then it's a small group coming together. And this is where I think it makes sense to include family members in the business that are already actively in the business to take part in the process to lay out number 2, the top right. Where do we want to be, not just in 1 year, but in 3 to 5 years, that longer term vision. And then once you come up with that set of goals or that destination, then it's really articulating and clarifying what are the critical few priorities, in essence, the strategy to get there. And then not just stopping at what those are, but then breaking those down into actionable behaviors and key initiatives. Who does what when, and what will we do to accomplish or achieve the strategy? Next slide, please. So an obvious best practice, but I know it's one that's oftentimes overlooked and or delayed, is I don't believe you start strategic planning looking inward first. That's the knee-jerk reaction. I believe you look outside first. Regardless of how good or at times how bad things are, the first thing strategic planning asks all of us is what are the top trends that are most likely impacting our organization? So looking outside at customer trends, competitive trends, supplier trends, regulatory trends, technology trends, a lot of which may be out of our control, but being cognizant of them and acknowledging them helps sets the stage to say, how do we have to adapt in order to compete, not only compete, but win in a changing environment? So the first rule of thumb, and perhaps the most important one, is don't plan in a vacuum. There is a place and time for in the process to take a look at what we're doing today and how we're doing it. But I think you start first. I know you start first for the most robust plans and saying what's going on around us. Next slide. When you do turn the laser inward, it's important to get a good baseline on where the company is today. I would say the critical few 5 or 6 areas of data that are most important from where I sit, based on experience in working with multiple types of groups. Obviously, there's some variation, but nonetheless, getting an understanding of number 1, your financial performance over a period of time. It doesn't tell me much when I'm going into a client environment and I get 1 year of financials. But if I, at a glance, can take a look at an income statement stretched across multiple years, say 5 to 10 years, and I just have a column for each one of the years at a high-level income statement, I can start taking a look at compound annual growth rates of revenue. What are the growth rates of our expenses? Are we getting significant, are we growing profitability at the same rate that the top line's growing? So there's a lot we can learn with number 1, the summary financial. And again, the important piece is to line up the income statements, and if you like, the balance sheets, to take a look at the changes over time to identify the positive and negative trends. The second area, folks, is really digging in and understanding who we're targeting and who we're currently serving our customers. And as basic as it sounds, I can't tell you how many insights it has given some of the groups I've worked with through the years to just do a rack and stack of our customers, saying where are we getting our revenue and where are we getting our profitability. Both components are important. In fact, at times in working with groups, everyone understands typically where we're spending the most time, and typically that's framed as the largest customer. But oftentimes an insight is that maybe our least profitable and or not as profitable at others. So then the takeaway from that would ultimately be, how do we get more of our sweet spot customer? What's the right profile? And or the identification of those customers that are currently maybe just a tier below that we can bump up to be one of our key accounts. Third area of information as you look inward is product and service rankings, taking a look at those discrete products and services that you do and comparing them. Where are we generating our revenue? Where are we getting our profitability? Number 4 is about the selling. How do we reach our markets? How successful are we with our current sales force? What's their close ratio? So all of those selling metrics, if you will, are important. The 5th area are operational metrics. Whatever is important for your business, is there a dashboard? Is it on-time delivery? Is it quality? Is it labor per hour? Any sort of metric that helps give you a gauge. And again, the important thing is to see how that flows over time. Are we getting better or worse? And then, of course, asking the question why. And then, of course, you want to take a look at the culture. You want to take a look at people. Are we retaining people? Are we successful in recruiting people? How are we doing in customer, or I should say employee surveys? So number 6 is all about the most important resource that you have, and that's your team. Ultimately, my suggestion to folks in a best practice here is, we can't take so much data that we boil the ocean. It leads to analysis paralysis. But coming up with key insights across these 6 areas at the very least, and packaging them in usable format can be really informative then as you set the stage for strategic planning and helping you assess where is the company at today. Mike, when you can, please. Ladies and gentlemen, it's less important for you to really zero in on the SWOT, but for those of you that aren't familiar with the acronym, it's basically SWOT for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. One of the things that I find is there's so much data that one could potentially look at. And so what I like to do is, once we have the data in place, I ask individuals to review it, and then we get together as a group, not to start planning yet per se, but really ask, what are the biggest things most impacting us across the 4 quadrants of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats? It's not limited to what I'm about to say, but another best practice to ensure that you have that important coverage between internal to the organization and external is to loosely position the top row, which are strengths and weaknesses, to be internal. Asking your planning team, saying, what are our biggest strengths? And by the way, when I take a look at strengths, I don't merely ask, what are we doing well? I view strategy as a competitive endeavor. I try to ask, where do we have unique competitive advantage? And if not unique, where are we different than most? Maybe not everybody, but what can we hang our hat on and really leverage going forward? So when you think of that top left quadrant, you're thinking about competitive advantage, differentiation. That far right, top right column is about weaknesses, challenges, issues. What are the biggest constraints holding us back? A best practice here is whatever is identified the group, typically it asking the question why multiple times before you get to the root cause. Our sales performance is not strong currently. We'll ask why. Well, it's because we're not reaching our clients in real time fast enough. And as a result, we've lost in the relationship. Why is that? Well, it might be because the way we're deploying our sales team is not giving them the ample time to develop those relationships. So an example of that weakness part is don't just stop at what hurts, but do some diagnosis and keep asking why to get you to the root cause. The bottom right is about threats, and loosely stated, I think it's helpful to say what is going on outside the organization that could be potential showstoppers, constraints, drags on the organization, and then identifying them and listing them there. So oftentimes in working with groups, those are economic, right? Things going on with the economy and a potential downturn. They could be regulatory, they could be technology. So think outside of the organization. Similarly, on the bottom left, you'll see opportunities. I'm okay making that a bit of a hybrid. That left box is where preliminarily, even before you go through the wrestling match of vetting opportunities, this is where you can list what you're hearing from your team, what you're hearing from family members in the business as top strategic opportunities that we might pursue. So that's that bottom left. Again, there's a balancing act here where you don't want this to be so populated that it's not usable. But by the same token, you don't have to prematurely vet everything so that everything is final. It's just a way of synthesizing a lot of stuff in the preparation for planning, both your data gathering, your look outside of the organization, and a working draft of some preliminary thoughts on strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Mike, next slide, please. So I've described it verbally, but in your heads, I'd like to leave you with a picture that at the end of the day, with all the academic or conceptual ways to define strategy and what it is, the simple way that I like to look at it is, again, think of a bridge, and you're really identifying on the far left, what is it that we most want to change about our company today? Where is it that we want to take our family business in the future, which is the far right? And then typically what should emerge are those 3, 4, or 5 big strategies that really move the needle to helping you get from where you're at to where you want to be. Oftentimes I'll have groups and we'll stop unfortunately at a place where we come up with 10, 15, 20 things. And during the planning process, that may give you a sense of security, but I'm here to tell you, as one who evaluates plans less on their elegance and their sophistication of the plan itself, and more by the results that they garner, a very key step, early step in helping facilitate implementability is going through the trade-offs and making choices, oftentimes between multiple good ideas. Because at the end of the day, you have unlimited opportunity given limited resources, and consequently, even if an idea is a good one, it's not enough for you to say, let's take it on. You have to look at it in the context of all the other things that are vying for your resources and your attention. So the picture I ask that you have in your head is, what is that yellow section in the middle that helps us get to where we're at to where we want to be? And if you're able ultimately to articulate it in these very, very concise, clear, and simple terms, it will make it easier for you to communicate to your team and ultimately allow them to contribute in execution. Next slide, please. When one takes a look at where it is they want to take their family business, again, it's more than a budgeting process of 1 year. It's starting to look longer term, whether it be 3 years, 5 years, or if you like, a little bit longer. The only reason I tend to stop at the 5 years is too much changes over a couple of years, much less 5+ years. So to me, that 3 to 5 range seems to be a nice sweet spot around which you can develop a strategy that's not too short-term in nature, but not so long that it almost becomes a little bit too soft. Oftentimes people ask me, how do you set goals, or what type of goals should I set? The easy answer is that it's not a one-size-fits-all. Ultimately, your litmus test should be what really will resonate with my family and with my organization so that it affects behavior. Ultimately, not everybody may realize all the details of the strategy or the strategic plan, but they should be able to not only understand, but feel the vision, feel where it is that the company's going, It's kind of when you put it out there, they say, I get it. I see where we're going. One way to do it is I'll share with you now. But again, it's not a prescription for everyone to do it in this way. What I'm about to offer to you here is a holistic, more balanced approach at goal setting. And it follows the Kaplan rule of thumb of balanced scorecards or balanced goal setting, saying that you can lay out goals over 4 quadrants. One are the obvious, where we all typically go to first. How big do we want to get? How fast do we want to grow? What kind of profitability do we want to realize? So that's the top left, those financial metrics. The one on the right is, what is our market position relative to the competition? Do we want to be 1, number 2? Do we want to be the go-to? Do we want to be the fastest growing? So that's giving us some goals that we're applying on a relative scale against our competition in our marketplace. And those can be very, very helpful because, again, it's taking where you want to go in comparison to what is going on outside of the organization. The bottom left is where you might want to take some specific operational metrics. I'm working with a group currently who, in their manufacturing facility, for a variety of reasons, probably not too different from some of you, their on-time delivery has gone down. The dependability of their supply chain has become less dependable. And so as a result, they're having to pick and choose and determine what to put in the queue. And unfortunately, they can't execute at the same level of on-time delivery as they've always prided themselves on. But they've set that goal of how to get back to it. And also they've beefed up some of their strategies in more real-time communication with their customers in regards to potential delays. The fourth area, folks, in goal setting, in addition to financial, the top left, the top right, market positioning, and then the bottom left, operational, that last one is around organizational. I don't mean to put it last because I think it's any less important. In fact, I think it could be the most important, particularly to a wider audience in your organization. In the next 3 to 5 years, what is it going to look and feel like to be part of your family business, part of your company? Do we have metrics around retention? Do we have metrics around training and development? Do we have goals around some sort of ranking that goes on outside of the organization about best place to work? So I present all of this to you just to give you examples and give you one model as to how to develop a vision or a set of goals, which provides ultimately then a strategic direction for you to craft a strategy. Mike, next slide, please. I lied, I didn't intend there to be transitions. So if you want to just go ahead and page down until you fill in 4, one more, go back up 1 if you could. Mike, actually, we'll go in order. My apologies. Let's start with 1 so it's easily more readable. Typically, people ask me, Jim, I get strategic priorities, but give us some examples as to what potential strategic priorities might look like. I'll give you examples of 4 zones, folks. The first zone that there may be a strategic priority around is who our customers are and or our target markets. Sometimes it's a change in how our target customer buys that leads to a strategic priority. It could be saying, you know what, our universe of current customers, they're not all the same. They're different. This group buys a different way. This group looks for a different product or service. This group prefers a different type of product. So how you segment, how you target, and ultimately how you define your customer, and as well, the identification of potentially, you might say, our growth goal has us growing 5x, but ultimately our current customer base can only take us 2x. It may lead to a strategic priority of a new geographic market and or going to an adjacent segment of your customer base, a segment that you may not have traditionally pursued. So the first zone, if you will, of strategy that could lead you to a priority is target markets and customers. If you could do a page down, Mike. A next area of priority could be around product or service offering, right? It's taking a look at enhancements to your current product set. It's adding additional service to existing products. It could be coming up with new products or new product development. Based on the segments we're targeting in number one, do we have the arrows in our quiver that our customer base is looking for? And ultimately, how do we price it so that we can achieve the profitability we're looking to achieve? Next, please. Folks, there could be some real strategic advantage and initiative around how you go to market. How many of what type of salespeople do we need selling what products? Just making a change there ultimately could be in a strategic initiative. And it could be also a significant source of strategic advantage. So know that how you're going to market, both from a marketing perspective and as well as selling perspective, could have in it some pieces of strategic priority. Next, please. Next. So it's grayed out, but another zone for strategic priority could be in your operating model, your business model. Is the way we deliver on our promise aligned to achieve the outcomes we're seeking? Or have we done what a lot of organizations do, which is the bolt-on strategy? We have a family business. We were founded in the early 1900s, and we just kept bolting on pieces where it works, but on certain days it feels a bit like Frankenstein, right? It's just kind of like it's still moving, it still looks and feels like something, but at the same time it's not as efficient or streamlined, and oftentimes we're having to cover up some of the inefficiencies and do things manually. So another area of strategic priority could be in your business model, how it is that you deliver on your promises, and taking a look at process, organization structure, and all the things that come with how we deliver on our promises. Next slide, please. In probably 90% of my work, which is really focused on the small to medium-sized privately held business, it just feels as if the 4 quadrants of growth is typically where we'll land in a growth strategy. That's my way of saying that if you want to take a look at 4 ways of growing, the 4 generic ways are listed here. And it's a Boston Consulting Group paradigm. I may have butchered it a bit, but ultimately it says that when an organization chooses to grow, it can pick up to 1, but potentially 4, depending on where it seeks to drive its growth. And those 4 areas include market penetration. And basically what that's saying is, as an organization, we've set a growth goal, and ultimately we know we can get there by taking our existing products and going to our existing markets and customer customer profile, and really trying to figure out how to get more of that market share. And typically this is the place you start because there's not a new variable. It's basically asking, how do we do what we do better, and how do we get more of it? Where things start changing a bit on at least one dimension are when you say, in order to reach our growth goals, we know that we have to supplement and complement our product set with new products and or services. So that leads to a product development priority or product development strategy. If you only change the variable of markets, but say we're not going to develop new products and services, we're just going to take our products and what we do and take it to a broader group of people, maybe a different demographic, a different geography. That's a strategic priority zeroed in on market development. And then lastly, there's that piece, and I've worked with a few of them there through the years for a variety of reasons. Their core business is declining, and therefore they've got to figure out a new business. And that is asking a business to really take a look at the change in 2 variables. Sometimes it takes a look at both who your customer is and what your products are. So that's diversification in the truest sense of the word. Diversification, not just for we've got to find a few differences. It's really saying, how do we change our business because our core business is deteriorating or diminishing based on changing circumstances outside of the company. So I offer this to you that once you get all the good ideas, one way to help start framing it for simplicity, for clarity, because with clarity comes power, is really trying to understand, are we trying to grow in 4 different boxes here, or are we going to get a better return by just picking 1, possibly 2? Next slide, please. So imagine a planning process where everyone gets together and a ton of ideas come to be. There's a lot of different criteria you can use, ladies and gentlemen, to really determine and make those choices and trade-offs. But to be able to zero in on the critical few is such a key aspect of strategic planning. I would say it's the ultimate task that you're doing strategic planning. It's not the brainstorming. It is ultimately making the decisions and the choices. And what I just wanted to demonstrate here, it's not rocket science, but it could be very, very helpful as a group to plot all of your initiatives based on impact and urgency and ultimately the resources to do them. If they fall on a high level on both dimensions, then it's in this green box, and typically those are ones that are like front of the line. Where it gets a little bit tougher are those initiatives where they fall in the blue and ultimately in the red, where for a variety of reasons, whether they have little to no impact or we don't have the resources to get them done, what do we do about those? So this is my way of just reinforcing the importance of making the choices, and it could be helpful not just to evaluate each individually, because what you'll find is all have merit, but once you start ranking them relative to each other, do we have the capability of making it happen and the resources to make it happen, and is it significant and impactful for our business? I think it helps start giving you a sense of dimension as to what your critical few should be. A parting shot in regards to these strategic priorities and initiatives. A lot of people in doing this try to get everything under the sun into their strategic plan. And if that's what you're looking for, and that's the stage of company that is most helpful, or that's the type of plan that's most helpful to you, more power to you. Just doing the planning is going to go a long way. But once you develop that planning muscle, try to reserve strategic planning to ask the question, what are we going to do differently? Because this is not your annual business plan. This is not your annual budget. This is saying, based on a changing environment and based on needs of the organization and goals for the organization, what are we going to do differently? Think about a sporting event, right? When you hear a sporting event and you ask the coach or the team, what's the strategy? They don't say, we're going to dribble the ball, we're going to shoot the ball. They talk about the opponent, they talk about the environment, the situation, and they talk about their competitive advantages, and they craft a strategy of what they're going to do differently for that particular game to get them to a different place. Next slide, please. So a couple of quick hits in my in my final 2 or 3 slides. One is it will be very, very helpful to realize that planning doesn't just start off going very cleanly and very powerfully. If you're anything like most of the groups, it takes time to develop the muscle. But in doing so, an acknowledgement that planning can't be only an event that you do once every couple of years and or just look at once a year. It has to become institutionalized in an efficient way. And ultimately, my way of framing it is, it should be an ongoing process that's reviewed throughout the year, and it should not just be looked at as an event. A couple of the best practices are to make sure there's alignment across all facets of the strategy. Mike, just for a moment, could you toggle down to the next slide? So folks, if you take a look at the green boxes on the left, that typically makes up the strategy if you wanted to see it at a glance. Obviously, there's a lot more detail behind it, but that second row is really about where do we want to go and what are our goals. This third row here is about if you had to give an elevator pitch to an employee, to a board member, to a friend, as to what your game plan is, what is it? And then this bottom row is breaking down these 5 items into the actionable initiatives for the current year. So breaking down a 3-year plan and saying, in this coming year, what are we going to do to achieve that strategic priority? So when I say alignment, if your vision has you growing by the example again of 10x, but your game plan is just doing some tweaks and process improvements here and there and not looking at new markets, there's obviously a disconnect. So when I say alignment, it's making sure that the game plan you put forth matches up with the vision that you've laid out for the organization. Mike, if you can go back one page, please. I've already talked about number 2, making choices is critically important. 3, for each of your strategic priorities, have an action plan. Who does what when for the coming year, and having them report to it on a regular basis. 4, it's helpful for top of mind awareness to keep a dashboard on our progress of not only the goals of the initiatives so that people can look at them on a monthly, quarterly basis. 5 is really trying to set a rhythm for ongoing plan management. At the very least, I think it's helpful to take a look at it every 4 months, so every trimester. If you can, try to increase it to monthly, but it need not be long, in-depth half days. Even reviewing it for an hour, where people have the expectation that they're going to do a very brief call, roll call or update, I should say, and then ultimately they're looking for feedback or input from the rest of the team in regards to issues, challenges, or opportunities. The last piece, everyone, on number 6 is you'll know that you've really ingrained strategic planning into your institution when you align some of the strategic goals with a unit or individual level goals. So for those of you that do individual team member goal setting each year, it's really cool to bring those 2 things together, the strategic goals and then the individual goals. Next slide, please. Next. Maybe a bit tougher to read, but I'm certain that the First Bank will provide you access to this if it's a bit harder to read. But I thought I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight just very briefly a few things that have either tweaked my thinking and or been something I've tried to dial up based on the past year and a half. One is, as tough as it is on all of us, from a planning perspective, taking a look at COVID not only as a cause of all of the challenges, but as an accelerator. Video conferencing was here before COVID, and you can see how mass adoption really accelerated then the use of video technology. Well, the same could be said about supply chains. If a supply chain was working, but it had some holes before, it was only exacerbated because of COVID. So where I'm going here is it can be a lot more empowering for all of us when we're doing planning to take a look at what is COVID showing us, what is it accelerating, because ultimately those trends likely would have come to us and or been brought out, but it was just accelerated. Second is I have a lot of organizations, and on most days I try to practice this, but it's tough even for me. Rather than wait for a snap back to the way things used to be, think about what the bounce forward is going to be. And that's a blend of a little bit of the way things were before and also some changes, and trying to anticipate and being flexible to those things is really important concept as you do strategic planning and trying to decide where your company fits within the bigger picture. A couple of strategy or planning process things. I'll only give you some of the critical few. Towards the middle of that second column, it can be very helpful, even though you set a 5-year goal or a 3-year goal and you take a look at your initiatives in 1-year increments, your action plans in 1-year increments, shorter time horizons, because too many things change too quickly, can be very helpful. So adjusting to a faster pace of change and developing your initiatives or your action plans around quarterly or 3 to 4 month time horizons can be helpful. Secondly, because there's so much uncertainty right now, and a lot of our management teams are having to react to changes in just the day-to-day part of what we do, what I call the execution side, it can be helpful to dedicate 2 separate teams. One that does the short-term planning around the day-to-day changes and how we execute, and I'll call that the execution team, and then also having a separate group called the development team. That team is charged with the 1, 2, or 3 big changes, longer term stuff, so that they can focus on that. If you're anything like a lot of the organizations I work with, you might not have the luxury of dividing it evenly, but at the very least, split screening and knowing there's an execution part of a plan and a development part of a plan can be very helpful. Very quickly, no one bats 1,000. If you go with the premise that I told you, that basically strategy is asking what are we going to do differently, you're not going to bat 1,000. So be open to fail not being the opposite of success, but being the stepping stone. And I encourage you to try new things and to do it in a disciplined way, which means failing fast and failing relatively cheaply. Next slide, please. So that's a really quick tour on the 3 concepts of strategic planning as a foundation for succession planning, why strategic planning is important, and then some best practices in doing your strategic planning. That said, I'll open it up to questions, and I'll ask both Joe and Mike to moderate as they see fit.
All right, thanks so much, Jim. That was fantastic information. Quick reminder to folks, if you have a question, go ahead and submit that through the webinar tool. Also, before we get to those questions, I do want to just kind of give a little plea for help here. If you could, at the end of the session, a survey is going to pop up. If you could take just a moment to fill that out, that will help us provide a better service to you, and we would really appreciate that. Okay, so with that said, let me jump into the questions here. This first one says, are there any tips for getting the current generation to see the need for strategic planning?
Yes, there's always a dynamic that goes on. So in addition to strategic planning, I'm asked to assist clients with succession planning as well. And as I said, they're very interrelated, but also they're different, right? They're different dynamics. One is a transfer of management responsibility and authority and ownership transfer. And then strategic planning is asking, where do we want to take the company? So they're very interrelated. And what I'd offer to everyone is that you should start first with where collectively across the 2 generations, or possibly 3, do we think the consensus is of where we want to take the business in 3 to 5 years. So bringing in the next generation earlier, meaning they may not have the leadership role yet, but they should at least be an observer to the process. They should feel free to weigh in, if not part of the planning team, at least to give their insights offline, because they need to see how the sausage is being made, because there's going to be a tug that typically happens, not to everybody, but to many, where sometimes a current generation says, I'm nearing the end of my exit, I'm more risk averse, I have less of a need for a liquidity event, so I'm going to tighten it up just a bit. And the next generation's chomping at the bit saying, grow, 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 and they can't grow fast enough. So coming up with that shared plan and bringing in the next generation sooner, again, it could be informal where you ask them to help fill out the SWOT. They can help give the current generation their input if they're not part of the planning team, or they could be active participants. But I think the sooner you can bring them in, the better.
All right, very good. Thank you for that. There was a comment here asking if we could potentially do a topic on transitioning a business to an employee-owned business, which is great feedback, and I encourage anyone else, if you have future topics that you would like to see, please, again, submit them through that survey that pops up as well. Another question here says,
if I might just interject really quickly, the focus here, based on the family-owned business, the Center for Family-Owned Business, is obviously a transition from generation to generation. But know that having a strategic plan also helps inform any sort of transition, even one that goes to employees in an ESOP. And so I just feel at the core of successful succession and or transition of ownership, regardless of its family or employee or other, there needs to be a growth plan, or at least a plan for where the business is going. Go ahead, Mike.
Very good. Thank you for that insight. Appreciate that. Another question here says, if we want to sell the business in the next 3 years, how do we plan for this? Do we exclude the next generation from the discussion?
Yeah, there's a lot of context that probably is required for this, but just some top of mind thoughts. I think getting giving them access to where some of the potential doors through which the business can go through can be helpful. And only whoever asks this question and all of you can ask when the timing is right, because family dynamics come into play. I think a lot of that decision for a lot of my clients is anyone in the next generation even wanting to be in the business and or capable of being in the business? So not knowing the answers to those questions, I think it's an individual decision that needs to be made as to how and when. But I just know that getting a third party involved to help facilitate whether or not the next generation is capable and wanting, and even just sharing with them the potential options. I use the door analogy. There might be 4 or 5 doors that could be the exit strategy for the current generation. But I think as soon as is appropriate is probably a good idea, because anytime I'm working with family business folks, I'm really trying to thread the needle on 2 circles: family harmony and business continuity. And if I don't pay attention to one side or another, typically it comes back to bite me. So again, sight unseen of where that question was coming from and the context around it, I can't tell you the specific timing, but as soon as is appropriate, I think is helpful, because even if you successfully sell your business, it could lead to family disharmony if they weren't given a heads up.
All right, very good. Thank you for that. Again, just a quick reminder, got a question, open up that webinar tool and type it in there, and we will ask that to our presenter. One more here, it says, what are the critical factors that can determine the success or failure of a strategic plan?
Trying to do too much is a critical one. It's a big one, right? Really, it's just lining up. A lot of people think that they have a choice as to the number of things that they can pursue. At the end of the day, if after matching up your strategic priority and who's leading it, how much it's going to cost, what type of mind share it's going to take to make it happen, because if you think about it, I define strategy in one way is asking what are we going to do differently to win and or to achieve our longer term goal. By definition, doing something different requires an additional level of effort. And so with that being said, if you don't take the time to match up what it's going to take to make something happen and then evaluate it across all the potential ideas, you'll feel great at the end of planning saying, gosh, how could we not succeed with 20 items? But I'll almost guarantee you that you'll dilute yourself so much that you might, if you're lucky, inch along across the 20 instead of really pushing all the way through to get the impact that you deserve. So the first thing I'd say is trying to do too much. The third is to not set a series of milestones in your strategic plan as to know whether or not you're making progress. So if you have a significant revenue goal and you're trying to go to a new market, even though you're shooting or throwing darts, set some preliminary gates, if you will, some milestones as to what you'd like to hit, because that will help inform the type of action and or strategy you need to make it happen. There's one thing I know about most budgets, and one thing I know about most plans is they're never going to go exactly as you intend. But what a good budget and or a good plan allows you to do is it allows you to have intelligent and actionable conversation to say, how did things go based on the way we thought they would, and why did they not go the way we thought it would, and now what are we going to do differently? So it gives you something to measure against and make adjustments for. I think then the other way to measure a good plan and or to make sure that you get the results or help ensure or increase the probability of results is to find a way to make it an ongoing topic in your management team discussions. There's a ton of ways to make it efficient. In other words, you don't have to do a planning session every month, but I think what you're owed is a progress update, and as importantly, asking the questions, what adjustments do we need to make, either based on what we were able to implement and or what changed around us. Because again, things will never, your plan is developed in a static time, right, over like a period, but you're implementing it over a dynamic environment. So you're going to always have to make adjustments and be open to that.
Very good. Thank you so much for that insight, Jim. So that was the last question that we have. I do want to be mindful of folks' time, so we are going to go ahead and wrap up here. I'm going to turn it back over to Mr. Joe Ambrose.
Jim, thanks so much for the outstanding presentation. A lot of material, a lot to absorb. We left Jim's contact information up on the screen. Please feel free to reach out to him with any questions or thoughts. And thank you for joining us today. Please mark your calendars for September 14th at 11 a.m. Central Time. Our CEO, Shelley Seifert, will moderate a panel discussion with women leaders of successful family businesses. We look forward to seeing you then. Thanks and stay healthy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Have a great day, everybody.